Stop me if you've heard this one before, but Wolfenstein 3D is perhaps the most significant game in the evolution of first-person shooters. But what's often forgotten is that it itself was a reinterpretation of another studio's work. The original Castle Wolfenstein games were developed by Muse for the Apple II, and they themselves were groundbreaking, being one of the first action-adventure series with a focus on stealth. The founders of id were huge Apple II nerds and loved the idea of remaking the labyrinthian exploration of this old series, especially if they could use John Carmack's new 3D technology. Well, I say 3D, and the game is called Wolfenstein 3D, but it wasn't really 3D as we know it, rather using raycasting to imply height and depth. This is all to say that Wolfenstein 3D is an icon of the first-person shooter genre, the Dracula from which all other FPS games spawned from. So when Bethesda acquired the MachineGames team and invited them to Texas to pitch a Wolfenstein sequel to id, this was a massive gamble. In the previous video in this MachineGames series, we explained how the team pitched their retro sci-fi reimagining of the story of BJ Blazkowicz. And in this episode, we're going to tackle how they pulled it off, both for 2014's Wolfenstein: The New Order and its 2017 sequel, Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. We're going to bring the MachineGames devs back to their work on these two games, how they crafted their version of BJ and the Nazi-infested world that surrounds him, how elements like gunplay and character perspective evolved between the games, the work that went into creating the many iconic moments throughout the series, and how the team decided to tackle the design of this guy. But first things first, how were MachineGames, a studio experienced with narrative FPS titles from their days at Starbreeze, going to craft a story around a character who is basically a mute, disembodied head?
We spent a few days just thinking about what we wanted to do with it, because obviously we wanted to do something different. We wanted to make it a MachineGames game. We wanted to focus a lot on the story because that, we came from that. And obviously, Wolfenstein wasn't really focused on story, the prior iterations. The 2009 did that to some extent, but it wasn't story first. It wasn't that heavy on the storytelling part. When we got this idea of moving it into the 60s, I think that's when it started to fall into place. Still pretty young during the Second World War, a soldier from Texas, a grunt. And it's also a little bit of this, Schwarzenegger 80s heroes type, right? And then we, just that idea of bringing him to the 60s if the Nazis won the war, I think that opens up a lot of doors, what we can do with his personality. Just more depth into the character, living through, not only the troubled childhood years, but also the war, and then, spending these 14 years in this mental hospital in Poland.
So with BJ, it was like, who is BJ? We know nothing about him. And so, so he's some tough-ass muscle guy. Who's like totally based on like an 80s action hero. So it starts from that, but then you basically know, he's older and more grizzled. He's like about 50 years old, so he's seen some shit at this point, right? We auditioned so many people for BJ, like I'm sure we had something like 200 auditions. And I'm like listening to them and it's like, yeah, this is pretty good, maybe not this, well, that's all right. And then this guy comes on and it's like perfect. And that's Brian Bloom, who we ended up casting, who is so totally incredible and like completely gets it. Amazing actor, amazing guy, just wonderful to be around and work with, and just completely gets what the character is.
Nazi scum. It is an interesting character to try to almost go from a stereotype, and as you say, we have this little pixel head that says "hurt me plenty," and then it needs to go into this kind of human character. But I think that one big thing that really helped there was his inner monologue that is happening throughout the game. He reflects on a lot of things. Sometimes it's deep and profound, and sometimes it's just cool one-liners, you know, catchy lines.
13 years old, from the pond by the stables, came out covered in leeches.
To try to push that was making sure that we could reach a very, very high quality. For us, you know, a new level of quality in terms of detail, and a new level of detail when it comes to facial animation and expression in face, and all of those components. And then, of course, you know, not fully go away from this iconic, you know, super cool hero, because we need some elements of that, but also splicing in the human side and the deep narrative, and you know, there's a kindness in there, and there's depth in there.
Fuck me, B.J. Blazkowicz. I should have known only you would be dumb enough to do a daytime entry.
Lady.
Glad to have you back, Furnace.
Caroline, you're alive.
If you call shitting in a bag living, 3 pulverized vertebrae. You?
Head trauma, 4 inches of cast iron shrapnel right in the conch. Still in there.
Severed colon, septic shock, shattered pelvis.
Memory loss, flashbacks, 14 years in a loony bin.
Good to see you, William.
I think our goal was we need to make sure that now when we are part of Bethesda, that first we deliver on our promises, and we also need to make sure that we can be reliable as a studio and also as individuals running the studio.
The office was a complete mess, and I think we were like 35 people or something when I joined, or maybe even less. I switched room maybe 6 or 7 times in the first 6 months because everything in the office was still being like refurbished or, you know, decorated. So it was basically working in a construction site, you know, for 6 months or more. Everyone was very focused and very passionate, and there was already from the very get-go extreme clear mission in terms of this is what we're gonna do. So I think just finding yourself in an environment with very senior people and obviously very artistic and talented people, it's a rare opportunity, I think, that you actually get to jump on something like this. So I was very excited from the day one.
Yeah, I mean, we as a studio, we're still fairly small for the kind of games we make. I mean, we're like, it's a lot bigger than when I joined. We're up to about 150 or so people now, which is still tiny in comparison to some of the other studios that are making similar games. Clear vision is really key for the company as a whole, for us to be able to stay small. You know, we don't have that time for a lot of exploration where you're spending the first 12 months, 18 months figuring out what the game actually is and what's working and what's not working. So we all start out with some pretty clear ideas for the game.
Writing it has mainly been Tommy, our lead writer, and also Jens. He did a lot of writing for New Order, New Colossus, especially on the dialogue side.
Started to build kind of the plot after we had the levels, and that's actually a much better way of doing it because it also makes you, it forces you to come up with a much more interesting plot. Like, okay, you're gonna go to a nuclear submarine and blow up a castle. Like, how are you ending up there? Like,
I think quite quickly we had something that felt interesting and fresh, something that we could say, we haven't really seen this before. So when it comes to, for example, the architectural components, we were leaning in quite heavily to a certain style of architecture that is called brutalism. I think we usually have been referring to it as some type of neo-brutalism in our world, how things are built that could emphasize powerful and buildings that will make an impact and really, you know, say something. And pairing kind of brutalism with looking at the components in architectural that the Third Reich were actually looking at, you know, and then you have the legacy of the architectural, the Roman Empire as well, and then trying to mix those, and on top of that spreading a layer of tech retro sci-fi tech layer, and then combining all of those layers, and then you sprinkle a lot of narrative and interesting characters on top, and of course robots, and then you're starting to get a pretty interesting cake.
How tricky is it to get them to live with each other?
Very tricky, yeah, and a lot of iteration. And you know, if this was easy, everyone would do it, right? So it's absolutely not easy. And I mean, obviously you'll do things where you run into, you think that you have great ideas, right? And then it turns out maybe they weren't that great. And then you need to have the courage and the insight to say, okay, we tried this was not that good, let's try a different route. And that obviously happened a lot throughout that project as well. Trying to find the refined details and the exact design, yes, there's a lot of iteration and hard work.
In what ways then did the Rage engine benefit you guys? What stuff did you use and what stuff did you sort of not use as much of?
Tech-wise, we used everything they had. So we also used a bunch of things that was developed for the Doom 4 that never shipped. Because of the setting, they built a bunch of stuff that allowed us to do interesting changes to the environment in a contemporary setting that they ended up not using at all. Yeah, on top of that, we built a more interactive, destructible environment, because Wolfenstein kind of needs to look like you had a fight. Even though we're using like the same tech, we're building different games and we have different workflows, so we find different problems. It's like something that worked for them for years. It breaks down for us in like 6 months and we have to fix it. And that's mainly because, we do narrative, character-driven stuff, and it pokes at different aspects of the engine more than others. We had better character animation was the biggest thing. So we had to improve the fidelity and quality of how you animate characters. For New Order, we couldn't really push it a lot. The hardware at the time was not capable enough to pull off what we wanted to do, but we did as much as we could. One of the key cornerstones of the design is it needs to run at 60 FPS, and we can't sacrifice that for fidelity ever.
A lot of us in the company that was part of the beginning, born in the 70s or sometimes in the 60s. You know, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, so for me, like being surrounded with the type of media like, you know, comic book artists like Simon Bisley, Moebius, Enki Bilal, Jeff Darrow, you know, all the 2000 AD stuff, Judge Dredd, Heavy Metal magazine, and also the type of the movies that came out and the directors of that time, you know. You get into your DNA, I think, while you know, growing up in that type of context where attention to like world building and attention to a certain type of, to some extent, darkness, but not in a negative way, but you know, there's a grit, there's layering to all, and I think that kind of helped us a lot, and at least it helps me a lot, or maybe not helping, it's just part of who I am in terms of fleshing out worlds. And Wolfenstein being this kind of dystopian, kind of scary world to, you know, to flesh out, has a lot of that type of inspiration within, I would say.
MachineGames had a lot riding on Wolfenstein: The New Order. Fumbling the ball with a beloved IP would be a huge blow to their reputations, or even worse, it might cause Bethesda to reconsider their new Swedish investment. You'd imagine this would influence any team to play it safe, but the developers at MachineGames had so much experience flirting with disaster that they took the opposite approach, pushing design boundaries and working against the established first-person shooter rules at the time. It seemed like at every opportunity, MachineGames took the risky, interesting decision over the safe one. Perhaps playing it safe was riskier in the long run.
Oh, that's him, isn't it? That's him! What the hell?
You know, working with the story, like I said, you know, the story usually dictates quite a lot what we do with gameplay. But at the same time, it was also very important for us with Wolfenstein to go back a little bit to the retro. You know, we decided very early we want to have 100 health, 100 armor, you know, really go retro, because at that time it was basically all the first-person shooters you saw was, you know, generating health, you know, you're trying to avoid those type of elements. We also wanted to focus very much on the, you know, the heavy weapon part, which is a big part of Wolfenstein. And that in combination with a story where, you know, where we tackle, you know, some heavy subjects, of course. It's, you know, it's about fighting fascism. We have, you know, Nazis are our enemy. We really wanted to, you know, we want to be bold. We don't want to shy away from tough subjects. We don't want to shy away from making meaningful for the player to experience, you know. And I think the violence, I think it just comes out of that because we have to, you know, because you are fighting this evil, you know, and these evil forces, and they are using a lot of violence to people and to you, and we also want it to be fun, and killing Nazis is pretty fun.
There are so many different people in the team, you know, to make sure that the gunplay and the guns in Wolfenstein becomes what it is. The animations and the code and the effects and the 3D art and, you know, everything. And in the end also the gunplay, you know, to make sure that you have a good scenario where we can shoot a lot of baddies. I am primarily happy with the end result that we see in-game in both New Order and, you know, New Colossus when it comes to the gunplay and how those feel in first person, how they look and how they sound and all of that.
When it comes to guns, we wanted to have it pretty crazy, but still kind of rooted, if that makes sense. So I'd say the hard part was to make normal guns relevant while you also have these crazy guns. So you wouldn't just ditch the first ones later in the game. Well, in New Order we did dual wielding with only the same type of weapons. And then for the sequel we decided to go with mixing it up all up. That was a bit tricky, but I think it turned out pretty well. There's some guns that we don't allow dual wielding in that game, like the Laserkraftwerk. I think the Lasergewehr was pretty tricky to get powerful and right. We always wanted to make like a laser beam weapon, but I think that turned out okay. Then we did for the Laserkraftwerk, we did an upgrade that was kind of a railgun type of upgrade, like a nod back to earlier games. That was tricky to get right, but I think it turned out pretty well, and I think people also got it. Yeah, this is a railgun. So yeah, that was good.
We had a different gun behavior and different gun feel. So that was pretty much the work of one person through the entire project. But for the second Wolf, we set up a dedicated team. All they did was work on that. They started pre-prod before the old one was done, to start figuring out like how we want to do things.
I mean, how we approach weapons, specifically in Wolfenstein, it's such a big core component. They are part of the narrative even. So that's how we have set it up both in New Colossus and New Order. Their narrative beats to like when guns get introduced and the reason why. And I do think that's also part of why we have been fairly successful in terms of selling that power fantasy with the rifles. It's not like you just pick up a new rifle and it's like, oh, here's another one. There are introduction animations, there are certain scenes set up for this, there are certain combat scenarios specifically scripted for you to have a very fun time first time you pick up this gun and kind of basically learning how it's working out.
So one of the big issues with megatextures is the amount of time it took. You would build the environment would be baked down into a complete unique model for the entire world. And then they could go in and stamp on it, so modify every single pixel can become unique. Very cool tech, taking up a lot of space. Getting that to something that fits on a Blu-ray is complicated. But also the production schedule becomes complicated because like, well, we have 25 maps. They take about a day and a half each to bake. Horror story we had is for Old Blood, the biggest map that we had took 2 days to bake on our infrastructure at the time. It was like, we need to fix this. Like, this is broken. Okay, run a two-day bake and then machine failure. So we ended up panic buying new machine that was like 4 times as powerful. You could do it in half a day. And because we buy server infrastructure, it was Windows 8 rather than Windows 7.
Right.
And like 10% of the megatexture got corrupted for a completely unknown reason. It's like, okay, we have 3 days left. We can run one more bake on the old hardware. Okay, let's try it, see what happens. So unfortunately, it worked.
Trying to understand the IP, you know, trying to understand what is worth bringing forth, who is this character, you know, BJ Blazkowicz, who are the enemies, the antagonists and all of that. But then trying to shape something that feels new and fresh. And what we did with Wolfenstein, I think, was unexpected, because we took something that was not only just a mundane shooter. I love the old games, you know, I'm a huge fan, but we added a layer of narrative that wasn't there before. And navigating that narrative ambition in comparison with pushing the tech and the visuals and the art, and primarily also designs, and make the game feel interesting and fresh, that was a long and tough balancing act, I would say.
When Wolfenstein: The New Order was released, it was not what most critics or gamers expected, a narrative-rich first-person game which played with concepts of solidarity and anti-fascism with incredible confidence, no doubt a result of the studio's Swedish origins, a country which has long analysed their own complex involvement in World War II. A year later, the studio released a standalone prequel, Wolfenstein: The Old Blood, which had originally been planned to release as a set of DLC packs for New Order. But fans wouldn't have to wait too much longer for the second chapter in BJ's trilogy, as in 2017 MachineGames released Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, and brought Nazi fascism to the most unlikely of places, the shores of America.
What was cool was that this was our first sequel. I mean, I guess it depends on how you count Dark Athena or something, but that was more like a side thing, you know, it wasn't like a proper full game. New Colossus was like, this is a proper sequel, we don't have to spend all this time kind of setting up the characters in the world. You come in kind of knowing it, right? So all we have to do now is just kind of smack you in the face with awesome shit for the duration of the game. You have this horrible injury at the beginning of the game, like, how are we gonna deal with that? Can we put him in a wheelchair? First person wheelchair action? That would be pretty cool.
I wouldn't say that it was met with resistance, you know, but obviously a lot of question marks internally where people like, say what? In a wheelchair? How are we gonna strive? How are we gonna lean? How are we gonna move this thing around? And how do I do this if I'm doing, you know, like a lot of different things that, you know, needs to be solved. But in the end, you have kind of the elevator pitch there, like dual wielding battle rifles in a wheelchair. Yes, sounds awesome. Let's do it. But it's absolutely one of those kind of those moments that get drafted very early on in the narrative before everyone else have started to work on the game. And that is like one of the coolest maps in the game, that entire section.
One of the things I'm fairly proud of with all the games that we've done is that they all give you a really good experience quickly. You don't have to do a ton of onboarding and figure out the systems and whatnot. It's like, no, we drop you into the game. There may be some tutorialization, but you fairly quickly get to play the game. And then if we have advanced mechanics, we'll tell you along the way. In the Rage and also in Doom, but also in New Order, you didn't really have a body in the game. That's one of the changes we made for Wolf 2, because we wanted it to feel more grounded in the world, and it's easier to pull it out off if you are in the world. Like, you can still do it with the approach that we had done, but it's more complicated and a lot of hassle.
It's an important part for us as a studio, for the games we make, to have that kind of like full body awareness, that you feel really planted in the scene. So switching over to a full body, even though a lot of the body's off screen a lot of the time, it leads to you taking decisions that mean that, you know, it has to work as though a full body was there, so it keeps you a lot more grounded in the world.
I finally let it go.
Get off my... William, are you all right?
And then same thing there, it's like cool levels first. So then it's like, okay, you start on the nuclear submarine, you get out of it, there's this flying fortress kind of thing, and it's like sucking the submarine out of the sea with big ass magnets and shit, and we just keep going from there, just trying to find like crazy stuff. And then also it was really cool to kind of take it to America, because we have this alternate history and alternate timeline. We're able to do all of this Americana stuff.
New Order was very much a World War II-esque kind of story, whereas New Colossus, it gave us the opportunity to look a little bit beyond the war and see what are some of the things that would also have changed as a direct consequence of that.
One of the biggest lessons, at least in my mind, is to stay bold, dare to push the envelope, not back down, and believe in your ideas. And what we did with a lot of the things in New Order translated very well into New Colossus in terms of bold statements and bold ideas and design decisions that was almost even hard to pitch internally. But I think that's when you are on a good track, when you challenge yourself and you challenge your team.
There's lots of things coming into my mind when you say that, but what comes to your mind with the daring decisions that were in the second game?
Chopping the head off the main hero is one, right?
That was top of list for me.
Yeah, it's that's one thing.
Erfolgte in einem Bauernhaus nahe Dallas mit einem schnellen Einsatz.
The old and the weak are doomed.
So I think that you always need to try to dare do those crazy things. You know, there's a part of the or there's a segment in the production cycle where you really can be in like blue sky mode, and like wouldn't it be cool if, and it's a pretty short segment, I would say, where that can happen, but also when it's crucial.
The problem is always when you encounter stuff that you don't know can go wrong. At this point, we've done a number of games, we've done tremendous amounts of motion capture, and then we do this scene with Frau Engel in the beginning of New Colossus, where she's captured BJ and some other people on the bridge there. And it's very lengthy. And then you're like, does it have to be this lengthy? And then it's always the internal struggle of you're trying to cut it down, you take out as much as you think you can, and then it's like, okay, this is probably good now. Still pretty lengthy scene, it's like 5 minutes or something. But it's important because it sets up the whole story. It's like that scene, it sets up the antagonist, what the stakes are, everything. All of these things this scene has to accomplish, and there's like 10 people in the scene. Because it's the main cast, it's her, and it's her henchmen hanging around. So we have basically 10 people in the scene, and we're recording it, and the duration is 5 minutes. And then afterwards, the file is so fucking big, it cannot be opened.
Shit. So all that motion capture data is going into one file.
Yes, and you're like, and you don't want it to, you're so scared because when you get to the point of shooting a scene like that, it's so much choreography. There's so many, because we shoot that thing, it's just one big sequence. Because it's from first person, so you don't have any cuts really. And so just recording it is a tremendous amount of work. It's like really fine-tuning, figuring out the blocking of it, rehearsing it with the actors. The actors have to nail every line perfectly throughout these 5 minutes. Like, you can't cut away and take from another take or anything. It's like, this has to be perfect, the whole thing. And so like, you're building up to it, and you're building up to it, and, all the ducks align, and all the stars align. All the ducks are in the row. And then it ends up working, and you're so fucking happy. Like, yes, this is going to be great. And then the file doesn't open,
You're just another...
Oh no!
How did you resolve that? Did you have to re-record or?
No. Fortunately, the mocap guys went and bought like the biggest, most powerful computer they could lay their hands on, and that managed to open the file. But it's like you encounter these things throughout development that you don't realize they're not you can't understand that this can turn into a problem.
But one thing that we always try to do when we design our villains is to go with something that is rather towards eerie or unsettling, rather than the classic macho power dynamic approach. All enemies that we often design has this kind of subtle eeriness to them. And you know, you can't really call Frau Engel and Death Head subtle in terms of eeriness. It's eeriness 1000%. But we are never trying to make them as, you know, screaming, shouting, just that there's a constant power play in terms of aggression. Obviously they are aggressive and they are shouting and screaming, but that's not core to their essence. And that is something we carried with us moving forward as well. You know, specifically trying to work with facial features. It should be enough just seeing the concept art. You will be able to tell, like, no thank you, I don't want to go on a dinner with you, right? It should be very eerie. The contrast to a Nazi in a uniform, what is the contrast to that? Most likely someone with a lot of color. Maybe the clothing are like patched up and, you know, reused, and we kind of looked at the character cast, at least from a design point of view, as basically a bunch of stray cats. You know, all of them are a bit different, and I was trying to push, you know, the humanity and diversity, and making sure that you have an interesting cast that has a lot of different personas in there. At the end, all of them also needs to be, you know, that they feel like they belong together, like this outcast family, basically, which is opposed to the more strict uniform in dark colors and gray and black and all of that.
I'm sorry, did you need this boat?
Yes, motherfucker.
Do not underestimate the importance of casting. Like, if you have good people there, then you can really make some magic. So I had all of these amazing actors, and I gathered them around, and I said, like, so for kind of the recurring roles, I asked them, is there something you would enjoy if I put in the game for the sequel? And the character who played Fergus, or the actor who played Fergus, said, would be really cool with a robotic arm, I think. And I was like, okay, let's make a note of that. And then the actor who played Wyatt was like, what do you think? He was like, maybe some kind of drug addiction. I was like, okay, that sounds cool. So then I started thinking about it for the sequel, and I'd seen that because, you know, in Fallout 4 they have all of these animations for the Pip-Boy, and for the Vault also has these old-timey things. So I asked Todd or someone, I can't remember, like, who made this, and I got the information. It was some company in Australia. And I reached out to them. I was like, okay, we have this scene here. I was thinking maybe like a chameleon. And they were like, yeah, we can do that. And they started sending me sketches. And I was like, well, can we make kind of the camouflage stuff move on the body? Yeah, no problem. And they basically made that animation for us that we were able to track, basically, and put into the scene.
I do think that a lot of the environments really speaks for themselves. That we managed to squeeze in an insane amount of different type of environments in a fairly short game. And it really is a roller coaster in terms of what type of environment you're in, and the different moods that we have, and the visuals and how they sound and how they play out and present themselves.
We're starting from what would be the coolest locations to play in. So it's like, we want to do Area 52, and we want to do Venus, and okay, but how the fuck are we going from there to there? Like, how? What's the plot logic of that? And then I had this idea, well, maybe Hitler is there, and he has a casting call, and he wants to see them in person. It's such a producery thing to do, too. Like, pull out all the stuff, just fly them here.
Helene! Ja, kommen Sie. Haben Sie das gesehen? Fremde in meinem Büro. Würden Sie mir bitte verraten, wer in Gottes Namen das ist?
Ja, es sind Schauspieler, mein Führer.
Schauspieler?
Ja. Diese Männer wollen für die Rolle von William Joseph Blaskowitz vorsprechen. Es sind Schauspieler.
Sometimes you come up with something that's so out there, and then it's like, is this too crazy? And that's when it's really helpful to have like a group of people around you that you can really trust to call it like they see it.
You know, we try to look at it in a very black humor sense of way. We try to focus quite a lot on that because you should never underestimate the importance of humor in general. And I think it's important as well, even though we tackle heavy subjects, these are very evil characters. You have to build some type of over-the-topness into it and some humor into it, even if it's dark, but it can still be entertaining and fun. And I think that element is important.
Ein verräterischer Jude! No, mein Führer. I'm from Arizona.
And we actually wanted to add another element. We wanted to actually show Hitler's penis as well when he was peeing, but that was something that was a little bit too much, so we decided to skip that one. But that whole scene, when you can see his weakness, I think is very important in combination with the ruthlessness and how vicious they are. Yeah.
You monster! What are you going to do to me?
I will rape and murder you.
The idea that he thinks that BJ's so bad at acting as well that he's like, you know nothing about this guy.
Yes, but when he killed the guy, then it's celebration. This is my BJ.
I think my favorite part is when he shoots the third guy. He doesn's even look at him.
No, because he doesn't need to do his addition.
Yeah. Hitler's actually a good shot in your game.
Yes, he is.
It's kind of terrifyingly accurate.
Ist mehr als perfekt.
I heard originally his penis was going to be out as well at some point.
No, remember before when I said that sometimes you need to rein things in a bit? So I had this idea, like, kind of the concept around Hitler was that he was going to be extremely physical, like the opposite of spiritual, basically. If you have like a Nazi enemy, or in this case, like a very well-known, like the ultimate Nazi, like, how do you make something unique out of it? How do you make it interesting and something we haven't seen before? And you kind of need some conceptual thoughts around how that's going to work. And the thinking was that, okay, he's going to be extremely physical. So what he's doing in that scene is a lot about, he's eating, oh shit, he has to take a piss, and he's puking at one point, and it's like, he's coughing a lot, and it's like a very physical entity. And so I had this idea that, well, maybe we just see it, So I was slacking with Todd Vaughn, VP of production of Bethesda at the time, and I was like, do you think there would be a problem if we see Hitler's penis? It was like, yeah, I don't advise doing that. It was like, yeah, you're probably right. Maybe that's too much.
At least you found the line.
Yeah, exactly. It's important to find the line. We all need to be saved from ourselves sometimes.
Wolfenstein: The New Colossus is, by anyone's standards, a terrific game. It somehow manages to pull on players' heartstrings and hit their funny bones in equal measure, with some of the most farcical video game levels of all time, paired next to scenes of shockingly inhumane brutality. Throughout the development of these games, the studio had evolved into one of the most confident storytellers in the industry, and over the next few years they would add more side stories to their Wolfenstein universe, with 2019's Youngblood and Cyberpilot being co-developed between MachineGames and their Bethesda sister studio Arcane Lyon. We of course covered the history of both Arcane Lyon and the tragically now shut Arcane Austin in a previous documentary series. Our next and final video in this series on MachineGames focuses on the next chapter in this studio's history, their work on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. This doc is a good bit longer than the first two videos in this series, and like all of our work, will be available first for our early access patrons. So it's a good time to once again thank all of our patrons for their massive contributions to the work of us preserving these stories. We simply couldn't do any of this without you. But while indie would become the focus of the studio's efforts for the next few years, it's fair to say that MachineGames has unfinished business with Wolfenstein.
Obviously, we've grown a lot, and I'm not even like part of the oldest crew at MachineGames, but we are a bunch of people that have been working on this game for a long period of time. What you get from that is experience working together and trying out things, and that you know that you have capable people around you that can solve these weird things. And when you've done that a couple of times, the fear of failure is not the same. Then it can of course be, but how really are we going to do this, and how much time will this take, and can we trim the scope here to actually make it work, or whatever it might be. But there's basically no idea too big when it comes to this. And I think that's something we sometimes talk about internally as well. I mean, we can do anything. It's a video game, right? We can do anything. It's just a matter of execution and making it believable, and obviously in the end, fun.
The first game is very much about BJ and how he actually, and obviously he understands that the Nazis have won the war, but it's also a very personal journey for him. But at the same time, then he meets Anya. He starts to see that there are other things at play as well, not only fighting Nazis. And then moving into New Colossus, then we move into a wider group of people around you, being part of the resistance, something bigger and something also very like a family to you. But at the same time, you're also preparing to start and build your own family. I think this is important to say because we have always seen this as a trilogy. So that journey for BJ, even during those first weeks at id, when we mapped out New Order, we still had the plan for at least that character. What will happen in the second one? What will happen in the third one? So, and I think that's important to say because at least I hope that we're not done with Wolfenstein yet. We have a story to tell.
Watch out!
There were some, even internally, there were some controversy around that scene, but more so because we also have her whole upper body bare and naked, so you see her breasts too. I think what we wanted to go there was this, this primal behavior, and just, this is the last thing that she does, fighting before becoming a mother. So I think that whole part of her being pregnant and showing that in a way that vulnerability was very important to us.
Place has gone to shit.
I ain't been down here in nary a decade.
Like, I really love this moment with BJ's father in Mesquite, which is just straight up dramatic. Like, there's nothing absurd about it. It's just a good drama, I really like, that's a powerful, I love that scene. But it's in the same game as you have the audition scene with Hitler, Yeah, I really love that about Wolfenstein.
I think that whole scene and that whole sequence is obviously, the reason for it is being captivated by Triangle, but it has a very important part in the story because of the, Anya expecting twins, and he's building his own family and meeting his father. It's just an important scene for his storyline and for his character line.